Well, hello everyone, and welcome to my library. And do you know what I can't stop thinking about? I can't stop thinking about how many poets, mainly the romantic poets, were obsessed with duels, with many of them successfully hurting people, getting themselves into a lot of trouble, and no one ever talks about it. We always focus on their poetry, and it's great poetry, I'm not going to say it isn't, but we never talk about the duels, we never talk about all the petty drama these people got into, the blood they almost spilled. So let's go first to Pisa in 1882, where Lord Byron, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and their friend Edward Trelawney were all out one afternoon on a pistol practice, which ended up with all of them under investigation over a wounded Italian dragoon. So now, contrary to the most famous names here in the scenario, we have Shelley and Byron, the main little weird player here is Edward Trelawney, the 6-foot-high, raven black-haired man nicknamed the Pirate, very Don Juan character, who befriended Shelley over a shared interest of radical politics. Yet despite all of this, Shelley's wife, Mary Shelley, the famed writer of Frankenstein, noted that Trelawney had a smile which expresses good nature and kind-heartedness. Now, Trelawney was a biographer, novelist, and adventurer, a seafaring man, and a man with a very theatrical character, which will be important later, and one might say his enthusiasm and excitement sort of lent to the nature of fictionalisation of a lot of things. But we'll see that later on. Basically, the trio were with a lot of Byron's other friends, and they were out riding this Sunday afternoon, coming back from pistol practice when they were intercepted by an Italian dragoon racing back to Pisa. As he came through, he spooked one of the men's horses. Now, that doesn't seem a big deal, really, is it? They could have just shaken their heads with disapproval and left it at that, but no. The men felt like they needed to defend their honour, and that wouldn't have been an interesting story if they had not pursued the dragoon. So they all pursued the dragoon, and when they caught up to him, they harangued him and demanded for his name. But because this was a bit of a unnecessary laddish standoff, naturally, the dragoon only replied to them in insults, apparently in Italian and French. Now, the insults resulted in Byron and Trelawney demanding for a duel. I know, and they call women drama queens. This is also unnecessary, but it's basically the heart of romanticism. Now, duels have a really long history, don't need to say that, and though feuds and single combat date back to medieval tournaments, the single combat surrounding the question of honour really took shape in the 16th century in several of European countries and arrived in England in, the 1570s, around that. And honour culture really tapped into something amongst the British elite men, and it just so happened that this scenario here with the Italian dragoon happened to be with a bunch of noblemen and, quite frankly, also a load of toffs. So the dragoon, who was actually called Sergeant Major Stefano Marzi, was affronted at the suggestion of a duel and basically ordered them all to be arrested, which sent everyone into a really overdramatic frenzy. One of Byron's friends, who's called Count Pietro Gamba, attacked Marzi with a whip, and then Shelley charged his horse at him, which resulted in Shelley being knocked off from his horse. Another friend of theirs was Captain Hay. He was slashed across the cheek with Marzi's sabre, and according to Trelawney's account, quote, 2 dismounted men in soldier habits with swords came to his assistance. One seized on my horse rein at this moment. The dragoon made a violent blow at me with his sword. I put out an arm to arrest his when the foot soldier made a cut at me. I forced my horse on through the gates and escaped being wounded, although both the swords struck at me. Now, what's funny with this, on a side note, Trelawney's accounts there's a load of spelling mistakes within it, often even misspelling his own name on several occasions, which I find deeply relatable as a dyslexic. Not only did I misspell his name a couple of times also, I also misspell my name a lot. I misspell it as dubious rather than Dubois, a shocking amount. So really, I felt a lot for him when I was reading his misspellings because I totally get it. But needless to say, Marzi, the Italian dragoon, beat the group quite easily. And once he'd had enough of them, he rode through the gates of Pisa, but Byron couldn't let it go. I know, he's a real irritant, this one. The pride of these people is absolutely suffocating. So he returned to his Palazzo Lanfranchi and armed himself and went on the hunt for Marzi. And when he found Marzi, still on horseback, the Italian apparently extended his hand to shake Byron's and said, "Siete contento? Are you happy?" To which Byron replied by unsheathing his sword. So naturally, Marzi sped off, knowing he was potentially about to get stabbed, only to be stabbed in the side with a pitchfork by one of Byron's servants who was waiting for him. I'm sure we can all agree that this is giving major frat boy energy, whose egos are so delicate that they create huge dramas over nothing. Remember, this is purely because one of their horses got spooked because a fast horse went by them. Marzi managed to run himself to a doctor, and rumours began spreading around Pisa of the incident, to the extent of his injuries and gossiping that he was mortally wounded, he wasn't going to survive the night, and this scared the little noblemen frat boys. So in an attempt to do damage control, the English boys sent their servants into the street to try and clear their name, which, very undeservedly so. The group were investigated, but because Marzi survived, there weren't any ramifications for this rich, prissy English nobles and posh boys, a tale as old as time. The only real outcome at the end of it was the end of the friendship. The group of friends completely broke apart over this, with the major casualty being the friendship between Lord Byron and Percy Bysshe Shelley. Just a few months later, in July 1822, Percy Bysshe Shelley and Edward Williams set sail for Lerici. Trelawney, the same character here, the one that wrote the biography, as a former naval man, though I should say he never became an officer, so really he was just kind of a navy man but never got to that point. He wanted to accompany them to help them set sail, but he was held up by customs, and this, being held up by customs, proved to be completely fatal. Also, he likes to tell people. Trelawney had no idea, as he watched the men sail into the fog, that their bodies would be found washed up just 10 days later. Now this is where stories collide again, because it was allegedly Trelawney who snatched Shelley's heart as it burned from the cremation pile. A heart which would eventually land into the hands of Shelley's wife, Mary Shelley, who, as all the Gothic lovers love to tell the story, she wrapped his heart up in a piece of silk and put it in her husband's desk. Or rather, they thought it was his heart. It's believed it may have been either a calcified heart from earlier tubercular infection, or it was actually just his liver or something else, because Trelawney, the receiver of said heart, is a bit of a liar. He has a reputation for being one of the greatest liars amongst the Romantics, and I wouldn't trust anything he gave over to anyone. Trelawney's last biographer, Anne Hill, rumbled most of his wild tales. He never was a pirate, Froissart. He never knew Keats, despite saying that he did. They never even met, they weren't even friends. Trelawney was purely a product of romantic literature. He wrote his life out telling these stories to people because he wanted to be the romantic hero that everyone wrote about. So naturally, I wouldn't trust anything that he gave over as an artifact and say it was legitimate. Goodness knows where he got it, and why was he sticking his hand into a burning funeral pyre at a cremation. Ironically also, in 1823, just a year after Shelley's death, Byron enlisted Trelawney's services when travelling to Greece, and Trelawney was in Greece when Byron died also. And then when Trelawney died, strangely enough, he was 88, he outlived them all the way. When he got cremated, he asked for his ashes to be put near Shelley's grave, which to me is just a bit bonkers. I wouldn't bury myself next to my friends, but there we go. But before we get into all the really juicy details, I'd like to take a moment to thank today's sponsor, which is the wonderful Squarespace. Squarespace is an all-in-one website platform empowering individuals to create their online web presence or launch a passion project, or whatever you want to do. Combining 2 decades of industry-leading design expertise with cutting-edge AI technology to unlock the strongest creative potential, Squarespace's design intelligence empowers anyone to build a beautiful website tailored to their unique needs and craft a bespoke digital identity to use across one's entire online presence. I redesigned my website a couple of months ago to reflect my colours. I like it being a bit darker, and thankfully I could just do that with a few clicks. With Squarespace's thematic colour coding, etc., you can run your whole business easily on Squarespace as a one-platform solution, from receiving payments for products that you sell to donations from people who just like your content and want to give you a wee tip. And customers can pay with popular payment methods like Klarna, Apple Pay, Afterpay, and ClearPay. Squarespace also has an activity scheduling facilities, which allows your customers to book appointments. Also, it allows you to engage with your customers through email campaigns that are super simple to set up, all thanks to their email templates. So if you want to expand your business or just build a beautiful website for your blogging leisure, head to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/lady of the library to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Now, we can't talk about poets and dueling without mentioning the Honourable Alexander Pushkin, who loved dueling, or rather was involved in a lot of duels. I mean, the aristocrats in Imperial Russia were happy to fight a duel for any reason. If someone seemed to disrespect a nobleman challenged them to a duel to defend their honour, and noblemen were very easily offended, from bad jokes to literary disputes. I mean, Pushkin himself was guilty of this when he was younger. Granted he was younger. His first challenge that he made to a duel was when he was 17, and it was to his uncle for stealing the girl that he was dancing with at a ball. But they didn't duel, they just made up. But that's the level of sensitivity that continues into adulthood with other people. Now, most of the time, nothing happened. Pushkin was usually talked out of a duel by his friends, or other people were talked out of dueling with him. But people were hot-wired to challenge him to a duel, and he often accepted it, because it was more, shameful to not accept it, I suppose. Now, there are rumours that Pushkin participated in as many as 26 duels, but historians are only able to ascertain for 5 of them. But still, that's a lot of duels, considering it had been prohibited by Peter the Great, who, back in 1715, had ordered all duellers to be hanged, a rule which wasn't really taken seriously, and it wasn't a concern for the 18th and early 19th century noblemen at all. So Pushkin was a pretty badass man. He wasn't easily scared, and the people around Pushkin seemed to be easily triggered. The first was his friend Wilhelm, who challenged him to a duel after Pushkin turned his surname into an adjective, which was Kuchelbecherisch, in one of his epigrams that he was writing. So Wilhelm shot at Pushkin and completely missed, and the two eventually made up. Another bizarre duel that Pushkin found himself in was over orchestra music. I know, this is how petty people get. So Pushkin ordered a concert band to play a mazurka, but an unknown officer interjected and requested that the orchestra play a quadrille instead. Pushkin laughed at his interjection and then ordered the orchestra to play the mazurka again. Later on, Colonel Semyon Starov stepped up to Pushkin and accused him of insulting his officer, the one that interjected asking for different music. So the pair reasonably concluded that the only way to overcome such horrific circumstances was to duel. So they duelled the next day, but both of them missed their targets thanks to strong winds and a snowstorm, and the duel was postponed for another day, but they ended up reconciling and using their words instead. Third example of people challenging Pushkin to a duel, which is more reasonable in terms of honour, was by one of the Zubov brothers. The Zubov brothers were part of elite heritage ancestry. One of their fathers was an accomplice to the murder of Paul I, so they had a bit of a reputation. It said that one of the brothers allegedly beat Pushkin at cards, but Pushkin believed that the brother played dirty, and after losing, Pushkin kind of made a joke to the group out loud, remarking that swindlers shouldn't be paid out. Now, we don't know if he was playing dirty, but offended at the accusation, Zubov challenged him to a duel. Now, the duel, according to Peter Bartonev, went as such. Zubov shot and he missed Pushkin. Pushkin, however, didn't shoot him back, and instead asked him, "Are you satisfied?" In a strange turn of events, Zubov then ran to hug Pushkin, and Pushkin commented, "That's really unnecessary," before leaving. So really, what I can tell from all these incidents is that people who call for duels are men who just weren't hugged enough and turned to violence instead of just asking for a hug and using their words, which is quite sad. Now, Pushkin's final duel, which just so happened to be the second time that he challenged this person, was Georges Dantes, a French officer of the Russian Guard. and this duel sadly proved to be fatal. So in November 1836, Pushkin received an anonymous pasquinade called the Certificate of a Cuckold, which alluded to his wife Natalia's infidelity with Tsar Nicholas I. I know, big accusation here, and Pushkin was completely unable to challenge the leader of the country, obviously, so instead he challenged the closest thing he could find, which was Dantes. However, he couldn't challenge Dantes because soon after this incident, Dantes proposed to Natalia's sister, making him a brother-in-law. But after the wedding, rumours continued about Natalia's infidelity, and Pushkin believed that the source of the rumours was Dantes' adopted father, Baron van Heerkeren, which I can't say because I butchered the Dutch language. I tried to listen to someone saying this on the video, and that's the closest I can get, so I'm just calling him by his first name, which was Jacob. So Pushkin badmouthed both Jacob and Dantes in a letter, and Jacob responded by, you can guess it, challenging him to a duel. But the duel was brutal, because rather than shooting one another at 25 or 30 steps, the distance was set to just 10 steps. So this is a close range duel, and a quick one. Pushkin was shot in the stomach, and he died 2 days later. However, as he lay dying, Pushkin asked for Tsar Nicholas I's forgiveness, and Tsar Nicholas I gave more than just his forgiveness. After Pushkin's death, Nicholas I provided for Pushkin's family, ordering a grant of 10,000 rubles to be paid out to the family. He also paid off all of Pushkin's debts and gave a pension to his widow and the daughters, and took in Pushkin's sons as pages. Dantes, on the other hand, was stripped of his military titles and exiled from Russia, but he claims that was the best thing that happened to him because then he found political success in France. But yes, that's what I find fascinating about the Romantics. We read all their poetry, and really, they're quite dramatic and overcomplicated little beings. I mean, you can tell from their poetry they're a little bit oversensitive, but the idea that they were so obsessed with violence and honour duelling is just hilarious in of itself, because it's never really honourable, is it? It's always over the most pathetic reasons, and it just shows you that the sensitivity of people online is actually no different from several centuries ago in like the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries. But I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, thank you so much for watching. Please consider liking and subscribing, and thank you to my patrons as always, and I will see you soon for another video. And remember, be happy and healthy, and books save lives, so keep reading.